efforts on all parts. I am Reinmar Seidler, member of the steering committee of the New Hampshire Network. I'm going to just cover briefly a few housekeeping points before introducing our first speaker. And firstly, let's recall that this event takes place in and for Ndakina, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. We acknowledge with gratitude this land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded Ndakina through the generations. Our effort here is to contribute to the stewarding of this land into the future. Secondly, the event is being recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording when it's ready in a few days. And as always, please everyone remember to stay on mute the whole time to prevent odd echoes and auditory distractions of all sorts. We'll be leaving ample time for questions, hopefully, and we consider that a very important part of the event, so please use the chat function if you have a question, and we hope you do. Thanks very much. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, who will then introduce his co-speakers and co-authors. Roger Stephenson is the Northeast Regional Advocacy Director for Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In that role, Roger works to expand and strengthen the program's outreach and to promote state and federal climate and clean energy policies. Roger previously served as Special Assistant to the U.S. Secretary of the Interior and in the White House Council on Environmental Quality, as well as serving as National Field Director for the League of Conservation Voters and Vice President for Programs at Clean Air, Cool Planet. So longtime authority on climate change and assorted issues around that problem, that crisis. Roger is also co-author of Strategies to Accelerate Climate and Energy Action at the Local Level. So, welcome, Roger, and I wonder if you could start by giving us a little insight into how UCS developed the framework that you and your colleagues used to assess climate readiness in New England, and then also introduce your co-workers, Miriam, Israel, and Joe Field. Roger.
Thank you, Reinmar, and Susan and others, and very grateful for this opportunity to speak to all of you. I think we may focus a bit on New Hampshire tonight. I do want to reassure everyone that I was not a co-author. The very able authors of this report, I simply guided their work initially and created the work plan. You'll hear from Joe and Miriam in just a moment. So the Union of Concerned Scientists has been focused on the impacts of a changing climate in various ways. We have a number of reports over the years, ranging from underwater that combines Zillow real estate data with sea level rise scenarios for 23 coastal states to show the economics of sea level rise. We have another report showing the vulnerability of military bases around the United States. And the list goes on. We began shifting our work from climate impacts to resilience about 18 months ago, 2 years ago. And we've been in a learning mode internally and externally with partners to really think about what resilience means. And we're preparing for state-based resilience work, because after all, as we began this process, little was being done at the federal level. So this project started because we chose to examine the state of climate and energy planning and the state of climate and energy execution through the lens of this resilience gap framework, which I'll explain in a moment. New England offered an opportunity to assess progress And the scope, that is, limiting to 6 states in one region, persuaded us at UCS that the assessment might be achievable within the context of a 10-week fellowship, a sustainability fellowship, and through that program through the University of New Hampshire. So we're very grateful for the University of New Hampshire and the support of their sustainability program in putting this together. So we at UCS dedicated resources to support 2 graduate level fellows to do this work. I'm going to put up a slide, I hope, in a minute to talk about the resilience gap. And I'll put a link in the chat to where you can find the report at a when you're ready. And this is a link to the resilience gap framework. And I think I'll put on the screen my bearings here. Here we are. Can you see that?
Yep, looks great.
Good. So this is the
Roger, we're seeing a Word doc at the moment. Are we meant to be seeing a PowerPoint slide?
Yeah. Do you see it?
No, we're seeing
yeah.
a Word doc.
One participant can share at a time. Okay, how's this? Do you see
Yes.
Perfect.
That,
Yeah.
I think that's what you wanted.
So with respect to this is the one graph that I wanted to point out and talk about the resilience gap. Because of the delay from policymakers, because of roughly several decades of inaction, we are required now to address mitigation and adaptation simultaneously. By mitigation, reducing emissions. By adaptation, adapting to the climate changes that we have already purchased, that we are already experiencing. And I'll share with you, I'll get out of that screen for a moment, and talk about what we mean by the resilience gap. We define it as the scope and extent of climate change driven conditions for which communities, people, states remain unprepared. And by being unprepared, leaving states and people open to potentially harmful impacts. And we introduced this resilience gap in the report that I provided the link to. The report outlines 15 principles that are designed to be used by decision makers and practitioners, and we offered these principles. So the framework for the research that Joe and Miriam will describe in the results is the resilience gap principles. How are states progressing with respect to reducing emissions and adapting to climate change? The Union of Concerned Scientists is still looking at this and working with this and how we're going to move forward. The principles are structured around 3 basic themes: science, equity, and common sense ambition. Reinmar asked me to touch on a few of these principles. One was systems thinking. That is, as we are adapting, as we're mitigating, acknowledge that we live in an interconnected world, and a systems approach can help decision makers understand how a change in one component of the system can trigger changes, good or bad, in other components. Another theme, and this is something I know Joe and Miriam spotlighted, is maladaptation. What is maladaptation? Well, maladaptive policies are those that create, perpetuate, or exacerbate climate risk. Many decisions right now, many investments may be making communities less prepared for climate change and putting residents at increased risk. Examples include allowing housing or commercial construction based on outdated zoning. We've seen that through the FEMA flood maps, for example. Another might be an energy decision that perpetuates increased emissions. Even policies that reduce communities or policymakers' incentives to adapt are maladaptive. One might argue that offering LIHEAP money, that is the low-income housing energy assistance program money, offering that money in perpetuity without investing in weatherization or fuel switching, that is moving from oil to, say, heat pumps. One might argue that offering LIHEAP money in perpetuity without investing in weatherization or fuel switching is an example of maladaptation. In their report, Joe and Miriam laid out key recommendations for my organization to continue this research, and I'll highlight several of those recommendations. One is to periodically review state-by-state analyses as new policies or legislation or funding are introduced. For example, they were working on this in the beginning of the summer. We didn't have the Jobs Act. We didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act. Another recommendation was for potential outreach or research opportunities around maladaptation at the state level, because that is a concept that appeared to be new to many of the people they interviewed. Next is, how might we help states bring together adaptation and mitigation at the state level so that these different people are talking to one another? With that, I think what I'd like to do is introduce both Miriam and Joe together, and they can take it from there. I must say I'm quite proud as a liberal arts graduate to have hired and selected two fellows with such strong experience in the social sciences. Miriam Israel graduated from Tufts in 2018 with degrees in international relations and Middle Eastern studies, and she's now a dual degree student at the Fletcher School at Tufts and at the Harvard Divinity School, studying international environmental policy, human security, and the role of faith communities in combating climate change and creating effective climate policy. Jo Field is originally from Bristol, England. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Zoology, shout out there, as a zoology major, from the University of Bristol. Her master's degree in science communication from Cardiff in Wales. Jo is presently a PhD student. She's pursuing her PhD in natural resources and environmental studies at UNH. Her graduate research focuses on the roles of environmental stewardship, community engagement, and public participation in resilience. I'll hand it over to Joe and Miriam. You can take it from here.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone. Nice to be here with you. Joe, do you want to start us off, or do you want me to share?
If you have the slides handy, that would be great. I don't have them up right now, but I can pull them up if I need to.
Yeah, just a second. All right, how's that look?
Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, wait. There we go. Back.
Great. So, I mean, Roger, I feel like you gave an excellent overview of the resilience gap and the framework that we were using. So I'll skim over that bit, but I do want to give a little bit of a flavor of kind of how we approach the project. So Miriam, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Perfect. So as Roger was saying, our plan coming into the project was to look across the 6 New England states, looking at the climate action plans that each state has and other policies as well, looking at what resilience gaps exist. So gaps between the threats posed by climate change that states face and will continue to face, and their level of preparedness to handle these. So coming in with our social science backgrounds, we conducted a series of interviews we conducted a series of interviews with folks across different sectors. So some working in the mitigation space, some working in the adaptation space, with representation from each of the 6 New England states. And then we also assessed what was existing on paper. So we kind of framed our research around the state climate action plans, but we also looked across the board to see what other policies, pieces of legislation, programs, working groups, anything that was happening at the state level, we considered in our analysis. So I think, Roger made a good point, and I want to reiterate that this is very much captures a snapshot in time. So we did this over the summer last year, but of course, things have been continuing to happen across the region, which is exciting to see, but hard to keep up with. So our assessment does kind of just capture what we were finding at the time. But we used both the interviews and the desk work to kind of inform our analysis. So we used the 15 principles of the resilience gap framework, which we'll show in just a second. And we went through each of the 6 states. We looked at each of the principles to see what was going on, essentially. So we looked at the climate action plans first, and then we kind of grouped everything else. So any other policies or legislation we grouped together. Do you want to go to the next slide, Miriam?
Yes, apologies. Usually Joe does the slides, so I'm figuring it out. I'm not as good at it. So sorry about that. But yeah, so what you're looking at now is a lot of information on the screen at once. So feel free to just take a minute and look at everything that's on here. But basically what you're looking at is a stoplight chart that summarizes our analysis for all 6 New England states. So as Joe just described, we were using interviews and then this desk research and feeding that in to an analysis of climate action plans in each state, and then other state policies, programs, and initiatives. So you can see across the top the name of every state, and then there are 2 columns for the climate action plan and everything else. And we're assessing both of those pools of data against the 15 principles in the UCS resilience gap framework. So you can see each of the principles listed on the left-hand side, and we've sorted them into 3 categories. They're slightly different than the categories that Roger described. We reorganized them kind of in the process of doing our interviews to have sort of a better flow in terms of the conversation, and then for consistency, just kept them that way. And they are also ranked or ordered from left to right in terms of how well they align with the principles. So we have 3 categories, either yes, some, or no. So either the climate action plan or the other policies aligned pretty fully with the principle, in which case they're green. They aligned a little bit, sort of, maybe there are some gaps, those are yellow. And then where there was no evidence of alignment with the principle, those are in red, and those are no. So some key takeaways from this chart is that there's a wide variety between state climate action plans, particularly when you're looking at what exists on paper and then how well those plans are being implemented. Some plans look really good on paper, but have a lot of gaps in terms of implementation. Some don't really look that good on paper and also aren't being that well implemented. So we just found that there was a lot of range. And a lot of that was a result of political will and state leadership in addressing climate change and really investing in the process of creating these plans and then providing the resources to local government or agencies to really implement them. As Roger mentioned, one area where we did find a lot of gaps across every state was the weeding out maladaptation principle, which is the last one in the purple section. If you look across the chart, you see that it's entirely yellow and red. So there was no state that we felt was fully considering the risks of maladaptation and actively taking steps to weed out the potential. And as Roger mentioned too, this is a point in time. We were doing this research before the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act provided a lot more funding for adaptation efforts. And so we think it's important to consider the fact that with this influx of federal funding, there is really a lack on the state level of consideration for maladaptation. So there's a real potential there for kind of resources being directed in ways that, is not the most effective or efficient. And can have generally just negative effects in the long term for climate resilience. And then the other sort of thing to note about this chart is that you can see that there are pretty significant gaps on the bottom section. So the green, which is equity and community needs, or equity and community needs, which is questions about inclusion, environmental justice. A lot of states have really good ideas on paper, but are having trouble implementing fully in a way that is equitable and really inclusive of vulnerable populations. So that was one of the other things we like to flag about this chart. And we'll come back to this chart, but now we're going to go into a state-by-state rundown to just kind of get into more of the details. There we go.
I'll also just say that we normally present this the other way around. So we start with the states that are kind of aligning the most with the principles, but we're going to start at the back. So on the right side of the chart, we're going to start with New Hampshire and kind of work our way through. So I guess just an overview of what we were seeing in New Hampshire, looking at the Climate Action Plan. This was produced, it was published in 2009, so it's the oldest of the 6 states' climate action plans. At the time that it was made, it had several very ambitious recommendations for both mitigation and adaptation, but it's now certainly outdated, and majority of the recommendations were not implemented that were outlined in the plan. So this really is a big reason for a lot of the reds that you see, particularly in the other column there. So you can see there are areas where there are some greens in the climate action plan, but there's that's not necessarily translating into other policies. So that's kind of highlighting that there's that gap between what's existing on paper and how that's translating in terms of implementation. So just, I guess, to give a few recaps, I won't go through every principle, but I think some of the most significant shortfalls with New Hampshire that we were seeing really fall into this first category. So in terms of the principles that relate to policy life cycle. So the plan was heavily informed by evidence-based analyses. So a lot of these were conducted through some through the University of New Hampshire, but other groups within the state, and this was really a science-based approach, but that is not translating into how the state is using this information to inform its decision-making around climate. So some of the policies, so for example, the 10-year energy strategy that came out last year, we felt that it does not reflect that science-based approach to decision making. There's certainly some recognition that the state as a whole is not adopting a similar strategy to some of its neighboring states, but it's not necessarily being viewed as a bad thing or a shortcoming. So we, in terms of thinking about that science-based approach, New Hampshire is the only New England state that's yet to adopt any form of legislation that would really transition the state away from using fossil fuels, despite that recognition in the climate action plan that greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels do exacerbate climate impacts. We also found that, thinking beyond just the climate action plan, when we look at what is happening across the state in terms of addressing climate change and projected impacts, there is some consideration of climate impacts happening, which is great to see, but it's definitely oriented towards coastal issues. So thinking about sea level rise and other coastal hazards. There is some legislation around this, which is great to see, but that's really the only area that we're seeing anything like that currently within the state of New Hampshire. So that was, one of the things that we noticed across a lot of the states. There was kind of an emphasis on coastal issues, so thinking about sea level rise, storm surge, and other hazards. But this was very noticeable in New Hampshire when we think about other impacts. So for example, extreme heat, we didn't see any consideration for extreme heat at the state level. So there are definitely some inconsistencies there. Thinking about the next group of principles, long-term planning and policy revision, the state really does lack a long-term vision for climate planning. So there's no process for revising or updating the plan. At the time that it was created, there was no process like that established. So there's no real process for accountability in terms of the state's failure to act on the climate action plan or implement any of the recommendations. And there's also no statutory mandate for greenhouse gas emissions. So in the state legislature, it's the only New England state that doesn't have kind of mandates on greenhouse gas emission reductions, and it's the only state that's not a member of the US Climate Alliance. So thinking, I guess just I'm thinking about the pieces of this that relate to some of the other states and some of the things that I want to bring up later on. So I'm going to skip over some things for now. But in terms of thinking about the costs of inaction, this was something that stood out a lot to us in New Hampshire. So state leadership is very much focused on the economic costs of acting on climate change rather than what the kind of longer term cost would be of not acting. So this has really been a barrier that we felt to implementing some of the recommendations of the climate action plan, and also to kind of introducing other policies and legislation that would help us move forward. I'm going to turn over to the next slide. And for the rest of the states, we have just to kind of help you get your bearings, we have the state that we'll be talking about first in the column, and then we also have New Hampshire next to it. So you can just see at a glance how New Hampshire is aligning with the framework principles, but with how the other 5 New England states are acting as well. In Connecticut, you can see that there's a huge amount of variability in terms of how the climate action plan aligns with the principles of the resilience gap framework. In terms of mitigation in particular, we found that Connecticut really did emerge as an early leader. So, there's been action happening at the state level since around 2004, but progress towards meeting its mitigation targets has really it's been lagging, and a lot of it is because similar to the state of New Hampshire, there's no accountability or enforceability measures in place. So without those, it's not on track to meet greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for 2020, 2030, and 2050. And I think this is a great example of how we do need these accountability pieces to make sure that we do maintain progress. It's not enough just to say on paper we want these, we would like to meet these targets. I think we need to establish these processes to begin with from the get-go. In terms of adaptation, we found that in Connecticut, the state had recently expanded a lot of its funding for resilience projects, particularly through the Connecticut Green Bank. When we look across the region as a whole, Maine and Vermont also have green banks. Rhode Island has a similar infrastructure bank, but there's no kind of financial institutions set up in the state of New Hampshire to kind of help roll out climate funds for adaptation projects. So I just want to point that out as, that's been something that we saw was particularly beneficial in helping Connecticut move forward. And I think that in other states too, we've seen that happening, but it's not something that currently exists in New Hampshire. Just to tease out a few of the principles in the framework, if you look at the long-term planning and policy revision, and you see the reflect a long-term vision principle, you'll see that for both Connecticut and New Hampshire, it's not looking great. I do want to point out that there are perhaps different reasons for this. So when we conducted our assessment of Connecticut, at the time, and it's still not yet been published, Connecticut has adopted a phased approach to their climate action plan. So there's two phases to this. The first phase, which was published at the time that we did this assessment, focuses just on short-term recommendations. So these are recommendations that are implementable now, and therefore it doesn't really reflect that long-term vision. We're yet to see the second part, which does focus on this longer-term recommendations that would go, beyond this year, and would also update the short-term recommendations. We don't see that same phased approach in New Hampshire, so I just want to point out that although it looks perhaps similar to what is going on between the states, just looking at this, there's more to it there. So I just wanted to point that out. If we continue to go down and look at the equity and community needs principles, you'll see that Connecticut is doing pretty well to consider, principles related to equity and environmental justice. So throughout the phase one report, this is something that really is emphasized. Several recommendations prioritize both mitigation and adaptation efforts, in vulnerable communities, ensuring that the costs and the benefits are distributed equitably. And, there are a number of other policies and programs that have been established that really do focus on these issues too. So there's the Environmental Justice Program at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and we also have the Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Council, if I remember that right. And these are really great ways of moving forward on ensuring that the way that we're building resilience to climate change is done so in an equitable way. In the state of New Hampshire, and I think, if we think about the timing of when the state published the climate action plan, this was in 2009, and a lot of these concepts weren't really being discussed. We're not seeing, you can see that, in the chart, there's some nice greens for Connecticut, and that's not the case for New Hampshire. But we're not seeing this conversation around equity in when we look at what's happening to build climate resilience. I'm going to turn over to Miriam.
Awesome, thank you. Joe is the New Hampshire expert in the group, so just got lots of interesting insight there. I'm going to move maybe through this a little quickly, but and we are moving kind of from right to left. If you think back to the stoplight chart at the beginning, so the states are getting more and more aligned with the resilience framework. So we're seeing some improvements across the board, which is great, but definitely still some gaps. I think Rhode Island is a good example of a state that has been taking action on climate change for quite some time, similar to Connecticut. There has been a climate action plan in place for quite a long time, but mitigation and adaptation efforts have remained really siloed. The climate action plan is mostly just about adaptation and resilience, which is a positive in the context of this framework, but maybe it doesn't get at some of the mitigation needs that have to happen. And they're also not really being looked at together. So thinking about how that resilience gap is both relying on adaptation action and mitigation action to reduce, that middle space where there is vulnerability. It seems that there has been a bit of a lack of cohesive vision at the state level, in part due to political leadership and changing administrations, but also in part because state agencies are working on really different projects. So we have a Department of Transportation working on electric vehicle rollouts and other mass transit, but we also have Office of Energy Resources and Department of Environmental Management thinking more about adaptation and coastal vulnerability, and they're not really talking to each other, and it means that progress can be really slow on issues that are not already prioritized within an agency. So in terms of the policy life cycle section of the framework, we're seeing just some slow movement and a lack of kind of robust policy making and thinking. And especially in the weed out existing maladaptation category, Rhode Island has a very high percentage of coastline and population living in close proximity to the coast. And so has given a lot of thought to coastal adaptation. There's things like the Rhode Island Sea Grant and the University of Rhode Island that are really leading on a lot of that research. And the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, like Joe mentioned, that has been pretty leading as well in terms of issuing green bonds and funding for infrastructure that is centered around coastal adaptation. But there is kind of a lack of consideration around maladaptation. And we saw this particularly when thinking about potential development and infrastructure growth in the state. Rhode Island has been growing in terms of population, and there's an increased demand for things like housing and infrastructure updates. But given that a lot of that growth is happening in coastal areas or flood zones, it's really important to kind of weigh the benefit of development and growth now versus potential vulnerability and greater cost of maladaptation in the future. And I think there's a similar challenge in New Hampshire as well, weighing current economic needs or priorities against future benefits and kind of that cost incentive that maybe isn't as politically obvious to be making investments right now. In terms of equity and community needs, Rhode Island has done pretty well. I think it's one of the stronger states if you look at the equity and community needs section, partly because it is a very small state. They've had more success in community outreach and inclusive processes, but that also has been a priority of the Rhode Island Council, Climate Council. And there are equity committees within that council that have been, their sole job has been to collaborate with different communities and do outreach on adaptation plans in the state. And that is something that we haven't really seen be considered in New Hampshire. And I think there's, again, some parallels in terms of the way that that's been prioritized and how, devoting resources throughout the planning life cycle of a policy or a climate action plan can really help integrate insights from different communities and address some of maybe those vulnerability blind spots that we're not really seeing come up as much in New Hampshire. Oh, all right. And then on to Massachusetts. So a quick, okay, this one has all of them. That's fine. So all good. So a quick caveat about Massachusetts is that this was done, as we've mentioned before, in the summer before there was a pretty significant climate bill signed by Governor Baker in August. So there are some things that I think if we were to do this analysis now would be different because Massachusetts has filled in some of its gaps and established some pretty ambitious, especially mitigation targets. So these are, maybe would change. And so again, Massachusetts has been an early leader. The Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in, I think, 2008. It was the first state in the region to have a legislation on the books that addressed climate change and specifically the need to reduce carbon emissions. So it did have, they have had legislation for a really long time. And as a result, the action plan is pretty ambitious and looks really strong on paper. But it has had gaps in implementation, especially on issues of equity and community needs. If you look, it's a little hard to see, but just believe me that there's there have been some gaps there, despite kind of looking really good on paper. Mitigation has historically been a state priority. There's, really ambitious offshore wind programming and research, and there's a lot of, solar PV deployment in Massachusetts. So that has been a focus, but the issues of adaptation have often been only taken up by the state where there has been local advocacy and pressure put on either local government or state government, which has been an equity issue as well, since there, a lot of the decision-making power and government is located in the Boston area or, the eastern part of the state, but there are a lot of adaptation needs as well as environmental justice concerns in the western part of the state and central Massachusetts, around coal-fired powered plants and other issues. And there isn't always as much ability for communities and advocates in those areas of the state to have influence over decision makers, especially state legislation. Sorry, hold on, let me find my place again. And so again, sort of building on that point, funding has been a bit of an issue in terms of disparities between communities. It's often being channeled through municipalities, which on the one hand provides chance for local ownership of projects and maybe a more effective way to distribute resources. But it also means that it can be harder for low-income communities to access resources. A lot of the people we spoke with from Massachusetts express sort of issues around communities that have the most resources already, that are best prepared to advocate for themselves, are the ones being selected for state funding and things like grants, the municipal vulnerability program and other things like that, which can exacerbate, existing inequality and vulnerability. So although Massachusetts likes to describe itself as a regional leader and in many ways is a leader, there's a lot of gaps in terms of consistency, transparency and access, and then implementation, especially around equity and community needs.
Thanks, Miriam. For the interest of time, I'm gonna just really skim through this. But the main thing that I really want to point out here when we think about the state of Vermont is a lot of what we're seeing happen in Vermont has all happened pretty quickly. So the state passed the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2020, and this has really driven a lot of the state action. It's really also been a driver in helping coordinate approaches to both mitigation and adaptation. So the Comprehensive Energy Plan is very much consistent and in line with the State Climate Action Plan, and this is really great to see. And I really want to stress that this has kind of happened, since 2020. In the past few years, we've really seen Vermont leap ahead. And I think this is a great example of promise in terms of what a state can do if there is that political will to really act on climate. This is doable. There are federal funds there to kind of help states achieve some of their climate goals if they want to establish them. And if we look next door to Vermont being here in New Hampshire, I think it's a great example of seeing what can be done. That being said, there are definitely gaps that still exist, but I will skim over those at least for now, and we can if we have questions about that, we can speak about that. But another piece that I really want to stress here is that public pressure has been a key driver from citizens and from advocacy groups within the state of Vermont to kind of drive the state government to act on climate. And again, I think this is a great example that could be nice to look to if we think about what needs to be done in the state of New Hampshire and ways to achieve that. I will wrap this up quickly, but I also want to stress again that this kind of focus on equity and environmental justice really came through when we were looking at both the Climate Action Plan, but other policies and pieces of legislation within Vermont. So this is really promising to see, but in our interviews especially, we found there were definitely concerns about how, particularly in the implementation of policies, how these will translate to kind of serve the most vulnerable populations to the projected impacts of climate change.
Awesome. And now our last state, very exciting. I know we're throwing a ton of information out, but Maine is the state that was most aligned with the resilience framework. So that's the state with the most solid green and then some yellow. Again, just like Vermont, like Joe just mentioned, this happened pretty quickly for Maine prior to 2018. Given the administration, there was very little action on climate change mitigation or adaptation, and some like active hostility too. But since 2018, there's been a lot of progress, and Maine has is a really impressive example of what can be accomplished when there's concerted political will and effort to really move quickly in establishing plans and implementing them as well. Maine's climate action plan, Maine Won't Wait, is a really great example of systems thinking and kind of robust policy making. There are systems in place to update the plan to integrate the newest, most available science, and Maine has been really concerned with kind of staying on track to meet science-based targets, which is great to see that, and great to know that that's achievable in a pretty short time frame. Another element of Maine's climate action plan is that there could be more done to prioritize equity and inclusion, both in the climate action plan and in other state programs. It's not to say that this isn't happening, but much of it is informal and kind of ongoing. So the people we spoke with, could name a lot of examples of ways that the state and other programs are working on this, but it hasn't really been put to paper in a way that's public and that we could analyze. So although we, heard anecdotally that there's concerns around equity and inclusion, there's still a bit to be done to kind of bring the documents that exist on paper into alignment with some of those goals. And Maine is currently on track to exceed mitigation targets, which is pretty rare and impressive. And a lot of that is because they just have a ton of forests, so there's a lot of carbon sinks. But even so, there's been a lot of changes in terms of rolling out clean energy. But from an equity point of view, it is important to think about how some of that, rapid shifts towards carbon neutrality can potentially have adverse effects on marginalized communities in the forms of, economic shifts and changes in government priorities and the potential for vulnerable communities to get left behind in the transition. That came up a lot in our conversations around Maine. And I think it's something to consider with New Hampshire too, where you have, rural communities that maybe it's not feasible for them to be driving electric vehicles, or could be, put at risk when prices of gas go up, or there's really cold temperatures and maybe a heat pump, isn't something that people think is feasible. And just kind of thinking through really the day-to-day implications of some of these shifts that look really progressive and important on paper, but given the demographics of the state, could result in some barriers, or happen in a way that is really fast and maybe makes people feel kind of left behind. And then some of the other barriers that Maine is facing, especially to climate resilience, include limiting funding. There's just, as always, not enough funding available to get everything done, and a lack of a specialized workforce. So since Maine has such ambitious targets, they're facing kind of limits on people who can really roll out a lot of those goals and implement and deploy things like clean energy. And then federal and state bureaucracy and resistance to change by state utilities, which I think are also common problems, anywhere, but have been particularly difficult in Maine. And so I think while there are a lot of ways that Maine is definitely far ahead of where New Hampshire is, I think there are also some lessons to be learned from the example of Maine, and that there are enough similarities there that I think it kind of provides a roadmap of how with the right motivation and political will, there is a lot of potential to kind of transform economies and societies with inclusion in mind, but that there are, of course, barriers to keep in mind as well. And so with that, those are all of our states. Roger kind of talked about some of our recommendations, and we can just go through them quickly. So our recommendations, as Roger mentioned, were mostly tailored to the Union of Concerned Scientists and thinking about future research, but also for policymakers within specific states in New England. We hope that these this chart and this analysis is helpful in identifying gaps for priority areas for future climate action, whether you're an advocate or a policymaker or a researcher or just an individual. This framework highlights different areas that might be helpful to focus on within your state and given your state's unique circumstance and vulnerability. And then across the board, there's the need to better integrate climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. We really found that was pretty siloed, and I think that it has been that way for a long time, and there's some progress being made in terms of breaking down those barriers, especially in government agencies, but it could always be more they could be working in better parallel. And then we think it's really important to be monitoring how climate policies and legislation are translating into implementation. That was a really reoccurring theme where we see really great policy on paper, but then when you talk to people on the ground, not a lot of that is really happening. So making sure that, when a legislator passes a piece of legislation, that's actually happening in the way that it's intended to happen. And then considering opportunities for outreach and advocacy, especially around the issues we've kind of already brought up, maladaptation, siloing of adaptation and mitigation, and then gaps in follow through on equity, inclusion, and environmental justice. And I think with that, I'll go back to our main stoplight chart, but we can pause and then I'll turn it back over to you, Reinmar.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe and Miriam. That was awesome and very thorough. A couple of comments or observations. One thing is that this is one of the few areas of research where being shown being disproven within a few months is actually a positive thing, because as you mentioned a couple of times, there have been some pretty major changes, and I'm sure that if you did it again, you come up with some slightly different different data. Although I bet that some of the same problems would still exist, and we as an advocacy organization definitely need to keep that in mind and keep the pressure on. And then the other thing, which I think you mentioned in regards to Maine and Vermont, is that change can happen extremely rapidly, and that's a positive for us in New Hampshire, where we're struggling. But we should keep in mind that it doesn't take a very long time to catch up when we have the political will. So with that, I want to turn to some questions that we've got in the chat, and actually the first.
You're on mute,
Oops.
Sorry about that. So Mike F. is articulating a question which I think was a lot of people had in mind as you were talking, which is so other New England states are doing better than New Hampshire, at least in policy and planning. And why is that? And how can we change the situation, noting that action on the ground is more important than written plans? So I just wanted to answer that partly by turning to a couple of my colleagues here who've been working very intensively just in the last couple of weeks on legislation that some of which can address these particular issues. And Joe, are you there? Do you want to talk about one of the bills that you've been working on?
Sure, Reinmar, I'd be happy to do that. I think there are two bills we probably want to talk about, and I think that John Gage would probably want to talk about one of them, which is House Bill 372, which was in hearings today. Where's John? Like, have a shaking of his head, yes?
Yep.
Yeah, I'll leave that.
He's set.
And what I'd like to cover is a Senate Bill 166, which had public hearing about 2 weeks ago. And that is a bill in our Senate here in New Hampshire, which is called an act relative to the grid. And it's really a measure looking to modernize our distribution electric grid here in New Hampshire. And it was an effort of starting back in August, myself, Sam Evans-Brown from Clean Energy New Hampshire, Don Crease for our consumer advocate in New Hampshire, and Cliff Below, who was the assistant mayor of Lebanon, who actually wrote the restructuring legislation in 1996. He looks very good for his years too, so. But the four of us worked pretty hard over this fall to really envision what a grid modernization bill would look like. Cliff actually drafted some legislative language in November, and then asked Senator Waters from our coastal areas in New Hampshire to actually make the bill more palatable to the Senate, and it was introduced by Senator Waters to the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee in early January. And it's turning out that the bill has bipartisan support, not only from Senator Waters, who's a Democrat, but also from the chairman of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee of the Senate. So it's got some bipartisan support. It's gone to public hearing. I'm hopeful that it will go on to executive session and be determined to be ought to pass, and then go on to the House later after crossover. And what the bill does is basically look at grid modernization. In the centerpiece of it is the formation of a commission. I'll call it a commission made up of bipartisan officials from around New Hampshire, including both private and public, and to actually guide the process of determining what needs to be done to our grid. So I'm hopeful that that commission will actually be the spark plug for moving things forward. The bill also encourages, probably that's not a strong enough word, it actually requires our distribution utilities to actually begin pilots in areas, and I'll call it the transactive energy areas, which includes things like vehicle to grid. It includes things such as energy storage, things such as shifting rates to time of use rates to actually encourage shifting of both demand and generation to areas that will actually benefit our grid. So we're pretty excited about it. Will it make its way through the legislative process? We'll see. It will next move on, assuming it passes the Senate. It'll move on after crossover to the House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, which I'm hopeful. I was at a committee meeting today, and I actually saw some positive nodding from some of our Republican colleagues in that committee. My hope is that they'll see the benefits of this bipartisan bill, and it'll get to the floor of the legislature and be passed, and then end up on the governor's desk, and that will be the great unknown as to whether that will actually be done. But I'm hopeful that bill will make its way to legislation and begin to move the state of New Hampshire forward on grid modernization. Because right now our grid is locked in the 1920s, folks. In fact, I will bet that some of the equipment we have on our system was actually designed and installed by Thomas Edison. So we got a way to go. So
Thank you, Joe. Excellent. And nice to know that even in a difficult political environment, steps toward a new energy economy can be made. And I wanted to check with John Gage. Maybe you could cover 208 and 372 just briefly. A couple more pieces of legislation that are in the works.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Reinmar, and great presentation. Thank you. So HCR 5 is to urge the taking of appropriate legal action against multinational fossil fuel companies for harms incurred from disinformation campaigns about the effects of fossil fuel combustion. This is basically a lawsuit for libel and fraud that a dozen or two other states have taken on. Attorney generals are suing the fossil fuel industry for their disinformation and delay of addressing their pollution, which is causing climate change. So I pasted our bills list and action page just so that everybody here knows about it. Joe maintains a list every week. You can check it on Sunday and submit testimony. And we're doing that. So we hope to generate some good interest on this, 73 in support and 3 opposed. We had about 26 written testimonies put in, and I think about 5 people testified in person. Despite that, it was exec several days ago, and just went down party lines. And we're seeing that a lot this session, just party line votes. And it depends who's there and who's not there on a particular day. There were 2 Democrats out, otherwise it would have been a tie. When it's tied, they can't break the tie. They just end up with no recommendation when it goes out of the committee and down to the full House vote. So that one got an expedient to legislate, ITL. So it probably will get no Republican support when it gets voted on the full House, but we'll see. Other states are going to be taking money from the fossil fuel industry. And in the report, I believe one of the main issues was the fear that if we sued the fossil fuel industry, that would raise our fossil fuel prices. The obvious argument against that is if other states are suing the fossil fuel industry and winning, and we don't, then we're going to be out money that the fossil fuel industry has kind of stolen from us. So that didn't really make sense to me. The second bill is HB 372. The hearing was today, and the executive session on it will be later this week. It's a bipartisan bill, 1 Democrat, 1 House member. It's an act relative to establishing a commission to study the short-term and long-term impacts of pending national and regional carbon pricing mechanisms on New Hampshire citizens, businesses, institutions, and environment. So this is something that everybody should be able to get behind. In the public testimony, 200 people weighed in to support it, which was fantastic. I think that might be our record. And only 2 opposed. So we had 99% public support for this one, about 70 written testimonies. And 7 or 8 people testified about business, health impacts, a lot of good angles. So we'll see how it goes, hoping that this is a bipartisan bill and we'll get bipartisan support for it in the exec. So I think that's all I have.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Joe and John. So what we basically see is that there's a lot of activity going on right now, which could potentially change the situation substantially. And one of our action points, which we'll be getting into later in this half hour, is to really encourage all of our membership to get online and indicate your opinion about as many pieces of legislation as you can, because that is really, I'm told, really it's noticed by legislators, especially in a small state like New Hampshire. These kinds of things can actually have a substantial effect. So I hope that that everybody listening will take it upon themselves to do that. It's very easy, by the way, to once you get online, and I think you guys will probably be able to put some links for people to get onto the House and the Senate websites and register opinions. Meanwhile, I would like to go to another question or two. Let me see if I can find one here. Mary Beth had a good question. Well, Mary Beth, you're here. Why don't you just unmute and ask your question? Yes, about evidence-based versus science-based.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you had one slide that said, you know, the method was evidence-based, but New Hampshire is not using science-based methods. And so I was just wondering if you were using them as synonyms or if you're making a distinction between evidence-based and science-based, and if so, what's the difference?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking for the clarification. In this example, what we're saying is I guess scientific evidence. So, you know, poor wording on our part to kind of shorten it both ways, but yeah, using them synonymously.
Okay. And it looks like you only looked at the climate action plan, and New Hampshire does have an energy strategy that they updated that many of us actually commented on. And I was wondering if you looked at that as part of this study or not.
Yes, we did look at the energy plan, and that was kind of, when we were assessing it as one of the kind of other policies that get lumped in that second column. I think one of the things that really stood out to us from the energy strategy is that, the specific wording that recognizes that New Hampshire is perhaps taking a different approach than other New England states are, and that is, in their eyes, that's a intentional, strategic choice, and that's not necessarily being seen as a bad thing, even though it's certainly not a climate-friendly approach to take. And this focus still, there's still an emphasis on fossil fuel use, and not looking to kind of have a strong green energy transition as other New England states are, is something that stood out to us. Miriam, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add about the 10-year energy strategy. I'm sure, Roger, you probably have lots of thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think anything for me, but Roger, go ahead.
I do have lots of thoughts, and I'm reminding myself that this is being recorded. We must say that the 10-year energy strategy is predicated on market forces, and the world and the state are replete with examples of market failures when it comes to energy, and ISO New England will admit that, and adaptation. We are in an all hands on deck moment with respect to making sure citizens of New Hampshire understand and aware how climate change will affect them and their families and their futures. We're in an all hands on deck moment where the work that we do on energy moving forward will have incredibly significant ramifications for the future. The 10-year energy strategy was written despite hundreds of public comments to focus on renewable energy, to reduce fossil fuel emissions. Was written in a way that ignored all of those, and that has happened twice. With respect to the climate action plan, I want to enter into a little bit of bipartisanship. Governor Lynch introduced the climate action plan through executive order. It was not a legislative moment. He did so because citizens in 165 towns the previous year had voted to support and approve a climate change resolution that asked Congress and the legislature to consider ways to reduce emissions in ways that protect the U.S. economy. That resolution also asked selectmen to consider appointing a local energy committee. That resolution passed in 165 towns, and then Commissioner Tom Burek confided in me that the Governor Lynch would talk about air pollution, but he would never mention climate change until that happened. So in response to one of the other questions in the chat, it is about people and constituent pressure. Governor Lynch signed the executive order. There was no funding. The University of New Hampshire, DES officials, Stonyfield Yogurt, and Eversource struggled to provide funding to help in the implementation of different elements of the climate action plan. And that only lasts so often. This is a combined state and private sector effort. Governor Lynch left office. We had Governor Maggie Hassan, and at that time, because of the function of the legislature and the divided government, I don't think there was any appetite for a climate action plan. So we do have an opportunity. We tried to get a greenhouse gas reduction goal, a bill in the legislature. The legislature had no appetite, and Tom Sherman opted to create an ad hoc commission on greenhouse gas emissions reduction. All of that information is online. It will remain a struggle to get a climate action plan and legislation to establish it, but that's essentially what we need. We need that and a target in order to put policies forward that address the adaptation and mitigation efforts that we sorely need.
Thank you, Roger. Awesome. Roger mentioned in the first part of your answer, you mentioned market forces. And Brett Gagnon has a question, which I think relates to that. In particular, a question about whether it's efficient to spend the time convincing legislature to change policy when there is also a push, a parallel push, one could say, around community power and electric aggregation. And so I'm wondering what you think of, in general, I guess one could say, about the difference between trying to work through a purely legislative pathway or pathways versus trying to work at a community level or at a business level on creating change in that way. How does that seem to you, having looked at these 6 states and compared them? Because it is heavy on legislation, obviously, the report. You're looking at a lot of legislation. What about community actions and actions from businesses?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just want to say that, we coming into the project, we were thinking about ways that we can really bind our research. We had 10 weeks to get the project done in, and one of the ways that we felt it was most appropriate to do that was to just explicitly focus on what's happening at the state level. So we didn't consider anything that was really happening at the regional level or at the local level. Of course, it came up a lot in conversation, especially where there are gaps at the state level. We know there are some really incredible organizations with boots on the ground that are doing some really incredible things, but it wasn't, we did not have the time to consider anything more than just what was happening at the state level for the sake of our assessment.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a difficult job because there is so much going on, but I think one of the takeaways from our research was that local governance systems really do make an impact, and I think that kind of gets to an element of this question where, personally, yes, community energy, community power, I think is a great idea, and I think also, especially in a state like New Hampshire, which is the largest legislature in the region, it's like over 400 delegates. There's a lot of opportunity to engage directly with policymakers. And I think if you can demonstrate through initiatives like community power that the community is already, and that their constituents are already moving in a direction, then they, you can kind of, as you all know well, you can kind of put pressure to enforce or to kind of roll through legislation that maybe they wouldn't have a strong incentive to support otherwise. And then if they don't want to, you're still heading in the direction of community power. So either way, you can kind of create a bit of a win-win situation by leveraging both the community preferences and potentially the political, the legislature as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you both. Joe, you have something to add to that? Joe Kwasnick.
Yeah, I am struck by the comment that it takes community pressure. We are noting that with our Republican-controlled legislature and governor's office, that even when we have overwhelming support for bills within the legislature, 144 for a bill, 2 against, the committees typically say inexpedient to legislate. So it's not working. We're not getting, community pressure is not working with these folks. And it's unfortunate. I keep thinking maybe I'm being too facetious here, but it's hard to educate some our knuckle draggers in terms of really getting away from ideology and really look at what the science and with the science and also what we should be doing within the state. And if I like one comment about the New Hampshire energy strategy, one of the big flaws I saw in it, the 10 goals, none of them were quantitative, and you cannot have a strategy without a quantitative goal. So nothing is going to happen with this particular strategy. Big surprise. No quantitative goals. Just it's really a wasted effort, very futile as far as I'm concerned. And just also want to mention there is House Bill 208, which was setting greenhouse gas emission limitations. That went to the executive session today within the Science, Technology, and Engineering Committee, and I don't know how that ended up. My guess is that it was probably found to be ITL. John, do you know?
I'm sorry, which one was that?
208, the one that set the greenhouse gas and limitations. It went
Yeah,
to
208, I believe. Let's see, there was a tie on that one. I think there was no
Climate
vote.
action plan.
They tried to do several things for it, and they were just getting ties. So I think it gets passed to the House with no recommendation.
It still gets to go to the floor of the legislature for a vote of the House.
Yeah, just no recommendation.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thanks, Reinmar. I'll go back to mute. Thank you.
Sure. Roger, I noticed that you put a link to that particular bill in the chat, and I'm wondering whether you want to say a sentence or two about what's in that bill, since it looks like it's still alive.
Well, I don't. I think we should look at the results of the executive session and learn from there. I'm not clear what the final outcome is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I tend to think. I mean, we do need. The state does need a plan of action, and the 2009 plan was put together by one of the largest and most diverse array of stakeholders ever assembled to address a problem of significance for the state. It was by executive order. There was little appetite to on the part of the legislature in the next session to fund any of the implementation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a situation too often, I'm afraid. Peter Bixby has his hand up. Peter, would you have a question?
Actually, I have a comment on the status of when a bill goes to the floor with no recommendation. So the default motion is that the first motion that will come forward is an ought to pass. So that is a good thing. And what will matter the most is who is in the room. The Republicans have a very small majority at this point, and it really depends on whether there are more absences on the Republican side than the Democratic side. And because of patterns of health issues, it tends to be the Republicans have a slight advantage. But one of the things that needs to happen is that whenever there's a bill coming up where attendance is really going to be matter, it helps if outside organizations can call representatives and say, are you going to be there? we really need you. The other thing is that there are a few Republican reps, mostly not on the ST&E committee, who actually have some clue that climate change matters and that that this needs to go forward. And if you can identify a handful of Republican reps who might be able to support it, that would also really help.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's see, Peter Bixby, you're a representative. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for being here. That's awesome, and it's great to hear your comment. We have another representative online here, Sherry Dutsey, and you have a question or a comment or one of each.
No, I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. I would just like to underscore everything that Peter has said. And one of the things that you have to realize, and I heard this before I was a legislator and I didn't believe it, but it was Representative Ladd who said at one point, I only take into consideration comments and emails I get from my constituents, people who vote for me. And I thought that was a little strange until I became a legislator and realized, yeah, that's exactly, I don't care. Well, you know, I mean, I really don't take into consideration what somebody writes me from Kansas or California or from Lebanon, or I represent my constituents in my district. So it's really important for people to understand that and to write to their legislator, you know, and try to let them know what they're thinking. I totally agree with Peter that it's an excellent idea when there's really important bills coming up. Put the pressure on your legislator to get there, especially if you know they're supportive of that bill. We have seen in the last session, which was a very divisive session, we saw 3 really important bills that did not go our way on a tie vote. When the vote is tied in the House Speaker makes the deciding vote, and it went against us. So one vote really, really is important. So, you know, target, it only takes 1 or 2. Come up with a strategy that targets. I mentioned before, if we have 165 towns that are really interested, you know, who are the representatives in that town? You can go up on Gen Court, go into the House, look under roster, and you can look, you know, in each of those towns and find out who the representatives are and what party they are, and try to get somebody locally to give them a call and convince them that they should pay more attention to these things. We've got 1,000 bills. We can't pay attention to all of them, but one call from one constituent could really make a difference. And that's how I would do it. It's a targeted approach.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Tutsi. And I think we should definitely always keep in mind in New Hampshire, we are very lucky in that we can actually have personal contact with our representatives. Not true in every state, but here we can, and it's a kind of a luxury. Now I'm going to just share my screen here for a moment and talk about some points of action. And there were some chats that have mentioned, well, a number of them have mentioned, what can we do? We've been talking about some of these things, and one of the important ones is to make your opinions known. A second action point for anybody on this call is to read Roger Stephenson's piece, which is a blog basically of the Union Concerned Scientists, called "For Global Climate Success, New England Must Seize Climate and Clean Energy Opportunities." Has a lot of detail about the kinds of questions that we've been talking about in a more generalized way. And then finally, what I would like to put into people's awareness is that we at New Hampshire Network are going to be putting together a letter, which will be in the form of an op-ed, but it'll also be a letter, and it'll be sent to as many of the Well, Governor Sununu's office and as many of the other legislators and committees as we can come up with, which will ask for specifically for movement on a number of these particular issues that we've been talking about, and to ask that that New Hampshire cease being a laggard and start to be a leader in New England. And what we would like to do is to get everybody on this call and all of our membership to sign in on this letter and send it within the next couple of weeks. So whoever's registered for this call will shortly receive the recording, link to the recording, and also link to this letter. And we would love it and appreciate it if you would be able to sign that and contribute your signature and help us move forward and by putting a little bit of pressure, extra pressure, before the legislative season ends. And with that, I would like to ask Susan Richmond, my colleague in New Hampshire Network, to talk a little bit about some further upcoming events that that we are planning. Susan, do you want to
Sure.
unmute?
Sure. So our next event will be next month, March 6th. And this is one that Roger has also helped to instigate. Last year, the legislature passed a bill allowing a process called advanced recycling to happen in New Hampshire, which means with so-called hard to recycle plastics, we're allowed to use high heat and harsh chemicals to break down those plastics. And of the 8 such sites in the US that were particularly studied by Roger and the people that are looking more carefully at this now, they all are much more toxic even than the sites around Cancer Alley where virgin plastic is created. So, and Roger, you're going to have to tell me the bill number. I don't have it in my head. There is a bill coming up, I think on Wednesday. Is that right, Roger? To ask that there be rulemaking around advanced recycling. So March 6th is going to be a session that we're sponsoring on advanced recycling. I don't know if this is the real title. I just sort of threw in, will New Hampshire tame this process? But I'm going to try and get that number. And no, there we go. Thanks, Sarah Childs. SB 267, and I believe it's Wednesday that the hearing is. Go check on Legiscan New Hampshire, put in SB 267, it'll give you the date. Since we have allowed this process to occur, we need to make sure that the DES steps up and says, yes, we need some guardrails. We need to make sure that we don't up our cancer game in New Hampshire because of this wonderful new toxic process. So March 6th, you'll learn more about it. The bill may still be kicking around because it may be heading over to the House of Representatives after it's been handled in the State House, in the Senate. And then our other 2 events coming up within the next week. Tomorrow, Joe has his legislation work group where he tells us what's up, where it's progressing, and where you can best put your energies. And then on Sunday, the plastic working group, same thing. And in both cases, lots of initiatives, lots of ways to take action, both just in the local level, that's a lot of what plastics does, and on the legislative level with Joe. And if you forget any of this, go to newhampshirenetwork.org and you'll see it all there. So thanks so much.
Thank you all for attending. We hope to see as many of you as possible on March 6th. And you'll hear from us within the next few days or less than a week, and continue the good work. Thank you all very much. And thanks to our guest speakers, especially. Lots of good suggestions from people.